Carlos Slim wasn't the first ever Mexican to be the world's richest man. That honor should probably go to Antonio de Obregón y Alcocer, the half Mexican who discovered and ran the greatest silver mine of all time, the Valenciana mine. That mine, by itself, was responsible for 60% of all the silver produced in the 18th century, so Slim has some ways to go. But I've always been fascinated at Mexico's wealth inequality. How did a country with 46.8 million people living in poverty also end up hosting one of the world's richest men? The answer is that they sold him a monopoly. In this video, the birth, development, and eventual sale of Mexico's telephone industry. Mexico's first small telephone networks emerged at the end of the 1800s, wired up by individual entrepreneurs under license. Then, the American telegraph equipment giant Western Electric set up a Mexican subsidiary called Compañía Telefónica Mexicana. However, Mexicana charged rather high rates. So, in the early 1900s, a Hungarian-American polylinguist named Jose Sitzensdatter received a concession for a competing network in Mexico City. He invited the Swedish telecom company Ericsson to help him, which they accepted in 1904. Mexicana was later taken over by another American company called International Telephone and Telegraph, or ITT for short. Over the next few decades, Mexicana and Ericsson were the only nationwide telecoms, with users on one network unable to call users on the other. Then came the Mexican Revolution, a long and violent nationalistic revolution that took years to consolidate its control. The general that finally did so was Lázaro Cárdenas, an economic nationalist. Cárdenas is perhaps most famous for expropriating the railways and the private oil companies. The later action founded the country's treasured state oil company, Pemex. Despite Cárdenas' left-wing streak, he largely left the telephone companies alone, though in 1936, Cárdenas ordered the two major players to interconnect, which they did across the country in 1941, except for Mexico City. Teléfonos de Mexico, or Telmex, was founded in 1947 with the goal of consolidation. Telmex first acquired the Ericsson telephone business and then ITT's a few years later in 1950. ITT and Ericsson jointly owned Telmex until 1958 when Mexican investors bought a majority share, officially making it Mexican-owned. The former owners assumed new roles as suppliers. Over the next 2 decades, the company expanded its network and adopted new technologies like microwaves. The cost of implementing this, plus integrating the ITT and Ericsson networks, invited the creeping participation of the Mexican government. Telmex grew over 10% a year in the 1960s, faster than telecoms in other developing nations. By 1967, it hosted 1 million telephones, and the network was robust enough to broadcast the Olympic Games in Mexico City and the moon landings. In 1972, the Mexican government bought the last 3% it needed to hit the 51% threshold and control. This nationalization, rather late by Latin American standards, came after a populist swing by President Luis Echeverría Alvarez. He had been facing political pressure from accusations that he was responsible for brutal 1968 repression of a student protest that may have left 300 plus dead. So throughout the 1970s, the Mexican government spent to improve the lives of a booming population. They implemented subsidies, free education and health care, and vastly expanded vital infrastructure. When the energy crises of the 1970s struck, the government spent more on subsidies to shield the poor from inflation. When inflation intensified near the end of the decade, those subsidies rose too. The government also nationalized much of the private economy, especially in the later 1970s. While some of the earlier nationalizations can be said to be strategic, many of these were just stealth bailouts of failing businesses. In 1976, the Mexican government officially designated Telmex a legal telephone monopoly, but regulated their rates. Such rates were chosen on consensus between Telmex and the government. At the start of the 1980s, Telmex was profitable, which is not always the case for a state-owned company, but it also suffered many significant problems. Its analog equipment was horribly outdated. Service and quality, particularly long-distance calls, were subpar. For example, a call going from Monterrey to Nuevo Laredo, about 200 kilometers away, had to route through Mexico City, 750 kilometers away, in the opposite direction, for a nearly 2,000-kilometer round trip. And it took forever to get a line installed at a new customer. In 1980, the company had a backlog of 1.5 million telephone line installations. Delays lasted 4 to 5 years, particularly in the rural areas. This was in part because Telmex struggled to get new equipment. Unlike AT&T, it didn't do its own R&D, so stuff had to be imported from abroad, 65% from ITT and the rest from Ericsson, forcing Telmex to borrow heavily in foreign currency. This worsened in 1985 when a massive magnitude 8 earthquake hit Mexico City, killing 10,000 people. As Mexico City was Telmex's most heavily networked area, this horrible tragedy cut 55,000 lines and inflicted $25 million of damage. The company also struggled with labor productivity. Telmex's employee base grew from 29,600 in 1981 to 50,000 in 1988. By 1990, it had over 10 employees for every 1,000 telephone lines. To compare, Spain's Telefonica had just 6 employees per 1,000 lines. And at any given time in the 1980s, 67,000 telephones were out of order and 1 million service requests left unattended. Corruption was also rife, with ghost telephone charges appearing on phone bills. The taxes were quite significant. In 1989, renting a telephone, remember that was how AT&T and all the telecoms did business back then, cost about 50,000 pesos. But customers also had to pay a 60% telephone fee and 15% value-added tax on top of that. So a 50,000 peso bill actually cost the customer 93,000 pesos. Telmex's struggles caused the country's telephone penetration to lag greatly behind. In 1988, Mexico had about 5.5 fixed telephone subscriptions per 100 people, most in the urban areas. To compare, the United States had 52.4 phones. The 1970s helped close the gap between the rich and the poor, but at a cost. By 1982, the Mexican government owned 1,155 companies, accounting for 18.5% of the national GDP. The country's finances were overstretched, with $80 billion of debt, and a significant amount of that foreign-denominated, mostly from the United States. That year, Mexico was hit when the United States Federal Reserve tightened interest rates to fight inflation. Moreover, oil prices crashed as a shortage turned into a glut. In August 1982, the Mexican finance minister, Jesus Silva Herzog, informed parties in the United States that Mexico would not be able to service its debt. Price subsidies for gasoline, tortillas, and bread were dialed down. The U.S. government and the International Monetary Fund provided a bailout, but under the condition that Mexico undo some of its old economic model and turn towards a more market-oriented approach. Import duties were lifted, markets liberalized, and perhaps most importantly for our story, shares in government-held companies were sold off. In 1989, the administration of President Carlos Salinas de Gortari announced that it would privatize Telmex. At this time, the company was still profitable. Its growth potential seemed rather high, and it contributed billions of pesos a year to the state treasury via dividends, direct taxes, and fees like the telephone fee. So why sell it off? Some of the proceeds would be used to pay off government debt, but there were other reasons. Mexico wanted to demonstrate a commitment to market reform. They were then in negotiations with the US and Canada over NAFTA. Also, Telmex was seen as an ideal guinea pig for the Salinas administration's privatization policies. The company was being skewered in the national media for corruption and bad service, and it wasn't a political hot potato like oil. The thinking was that a privately owned Telmex can expand basic infrastructure and add new services like cellular and data transmission far faster than a government-owned Telmex can do it. The government had to move fast with the sale because Salinas won the 1988 election by the thinness of margins and with allegations of fraud. He needed a win. Carlos Slim Helou, apologies to all about the pronunciations, was born in Mexico to a wealthy Lebanese Christian owner of a general store, the fifth of 6 sons. Slim has a fondness for numbers. In college, he taught linear algebra while writing his thesis about its applications to civil engineering. He is also passionate about history, mostly reads biographies, and has a special soft spot for Genghis Khan. After graduation, he worked as a stockbroker but dreamed of running businesses. His first purchase was in 1965, a struggling bottling plant called Jarritos del Sur, and turned it around. His business principles include keeping corporate and admin staff to a minimum and reinvesting profits into production and distribution. He is also a haggler and has before spent hours haggling over a $10 discount for a tie. He likes cheap deals. Anyway, Slim's career takes a turn with 2 major purchases in the late 1970s. The first was the 1976 purchase of 60% of the Gala's printing press of Mexico, a factory for printing calendars and other commercial images. They were struggling with workers on strike, suppliers not sending supplies, and 1,700 plus clients waiting for orders. The second major buy was the 1980 purchase of Mexican Tobacco, the country's second largest tobacco company. They sell a brand of Mexican cigarettes in partnership with Philip Morris International. Cigarette money provided crucial cash flow during the difficult 1980s and funded the future acquisitions of Slim's conglomerate, the Caro Group. The name is a combination of his own name and that of his wife, Samaya Domit. Business owners during the 1980s feared nationalization and sold majority share of their businesses at prices as low as 5% of book value. Slim, on the other hand, had confidence in Mexico's future, often referring to how his father bought out his business partner's share of the general store during the height of the Mexican Revolution in 1914. Those years were good for Carlos. Even so, Caro Group was not particularly big at the end of the 1980s, and Slim himself wasn't seen as Mexico's most powerful businessman. That is, until the Telmex privatization. The privatization method was quite complex, and that was to guarantee that the company remained Mexican-led. This is rather complicated, so bear with me. What the government was selling off was 20.4% of Telmex shares in the form of AA voting rights shares, which would give its owner operating control. The government converted the rest of its Telmex shares to either A shares, which were sold to Telmex's 50,000 employees, or a new class of L shares and retained for future sale. The original favored bidder for the 20% was Alpha Group, a long-running and well-regarded family business. But they lost interest when news came out that Mexico would also privatize the steel industry. They knew that industry better. With Alpha out, the favored bidder was a banking mogul named Roberto Hernandez, who already owned 10% of Telmex shares through a brokerage house. Carlos Slim was close to President Salinas, but has long denied that the president sold Telmex to him for a favor. He had, in fact, been reluctant to put in a bid. Salinas pitched the idea to him during a flight to Japan. Upon returning, Slim came home and reportedly told someone, "If I enter and win, it will change my life, and I don't know if that's what I want. The whole family gets together every Sunday at home. I'll talk to them this Sunday, and on Monday I'll let you know what I've decided." Slim ends up putting in that bid, setting up a group with the foreign telecoms Southwestern Bell in the United States and France Telecom in France. Hernandez's existing 10% Telmex stake could have been used to boost his bid. So key to Caro's $1.8 billion bid eventually winning in the end was Southwestern Bell deciding to put up an extra $72 million at the last second. After winning, Caro received 10% of the AA shares, of which half went to their 32 Mexican investor partners. The remaining 10% were split amongst the foreign telecom partners. As part of the privatization, the new investors had to agree to hit certain targets to reduce service wait and phone installation times. They had to improve lines per 1,000 people, phone density, and more. In return, they would retain the wireline monopoly until 1997. Telmex, under private ownerships, invested over $12 billion over the next 5 years. The network grew from 6 million lines in 1991 to 8.8 million in 1996. Lines per thousand people went from 6.5 in 1990 to 9.5. And targets for networked rural areas and payphone density were all met in 2 years. You can't say that Slim didn't invest in the networks. And crucially, much of the onerous telephone taxes on consumers were cut in exchange for taxes on Telmex's profits. Tariffs on local and international calls were also adjusted to global norms. The result was that even though rates increased significantly in 1990 before the privatization, the consumer only paid 5% more. This translated into a 44% jump in profit in 1990, right before the privatization. The unions also agreed to a small decline in headcount, allowing operating costs to fall. Slim really received a great deal here, and it was about to get even better. The concession barred Telmex from TV, but let them sell voice, data, and text services. The Mexican government also deregulated the cell phone market in 1990. They split up the whole country into zones and gave each zone 2 bands. One band would be run by Telmex's mobile subsidiary, Radio Movil Dipsa or Telcel, and the other split up amongst competitors. This gave Telmex a built-in advantage in the cellular market. It was the only company with nationwide coverage. They can also take advantage of access to Telmex's buildings and network. Even so, by 1994, Telcel had less than 50% market share of the mobile market, competing behind Cell Group. But their competitors' focus on selling postpaid plans to higher-class people backfired when the country fell into an economic crisis at the end of 1994. Telcel responded by launching an ingenious program called the Amigo Kit, prepaid cards that you can buy in Telcel stores for 100, 200, and 500 pesos a year. These brought mobile to the ordinary people and caught fire, catapulting Telcel into the lead. Cell never caught up and later became AT&T Mexico. In 2000, with the mobile market growing but still early, Slim spun off Telmex's mobile operations into a separate company called América Móvil. Enriched by the mobile boom that began in 1996, América Móvil started buying mobile telecoms in other Latin American regions like Brazil. Today, just 31% of company revenues come from Mexico. At the time, the government was seen as getting a good deal out of the Telmex shares they sold. They wanted a privatization that could be held up to the rest of the world as an example. Mexico wanted to keep the company in Mexican hands and get private capital holders to invest funds to improve operating performance. They got all of that. And as Telmex profits rose, the market value of the shares rose too, and the government sold off their remaining shares by 1992. The total sum raised from the privatization was about $6 billion, or about $13.5 billion today, by far the largest of the privatizations done then. All in all, the Mexican government raised over $20 billion from the 1980s privatizations of the various state-owned companies, sales that formed the cornerstone of other massive fortunes down the line, greatly widening the inequality gap. In 1987, the year before Salinas took office, Mexico had 1 billionaire on the Forbes rich list. By 1994, there were 24, as much as Brazil, United Kingdom, France, and Spain combined. Slim, of course, being the richest of them all. The creation of the Plutocrats invited corruption, leading the Salinas presidency to end in family scandal and violence. The president faced accusations that he understated Telmex's value at the time, recriminations that the government should have gotten more out of the deal. Salinas fled the country after his presidency and went into exile, though he returned in the 1990s. Millions of dollars were discovered in Swiss accounts and returned to the Mexican government. Perhaps he should have done a meme coin. Let's wrap this up. It's depressing me. The actual privatization process seems to have been handled quite professionally. The most significant criticism to be levied on the Mexican government has less to do with how, but why. Why did they sell off Telmex as it was, a complete single entity? It was unlike how things were done elsewhere. The United States broke up AT&T into Baby Bells, Brazil broke up Telebras into 12 companies called Baby Bras, and China broke up their telecom monopoly into 3 smaller providers before privatization. Worse yet, Telmex wasn't just sold wholesale, it was sold without restrictions keeping it out of cellular. It was even sold the only concession for nationwide cellular service. And where were the regulators? The agency Cofotel wasn't even set up until 1996, years after the deregulation. And in those early years, it was so defunded and neutered that they nicknamed it Cofol Telmex. Worse yet, while Telmex played a vital part of Slim's rise, Slim is way more than just Telmex and American Movil. After peaking at about $120 billion in early 2010, American Mobil's market capitalization declined to between 40 and 60 billion and has stayed there ever since. It is often overlooked that, strictly speaking, American shareholders earn more from American Mobil's growth than Slim himself did, particularly Southwestern Bell, which is now the current AT&T. So perhaps the thing to be most concerned about was how Slim was allowed to use the cash flows and control of Telmex to enter and dominate other parts of the economy. For instance, his purchasing Telmex led him to purchase one of the 2 big Mexican companies making copper cable. He soon bought out the other. He did the same for installation companies, construction, and commercial retail. Things like this are exactly why antitrust laws are how they are, extending a monopoly so far until suddenly it is everywhere. Slim bought a monopoly and used it to become a plutocrat. Alright everyone, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, sign up for the newsletter and the Patreon, and I'll see you guys next time.